The topic of investment in cardiovascular disease and its general direction away from cardiovascular disease came up in that last session. And I'm delighted that the next session is going to directly address this with an expert panel, CV investing in the next decade. And to host this panel, we have the pleasure of having Meg Tirrell, a reporter from CNBC who's covered the development of many new drugs, whether in Alzheimer's, cancer, rare diseases, and also has had a history of coverage of major health emergencies, whether they be Ebola, Zika, or the common diseases that we are all treating. So please welcome Meg and the panel to the podium, and look forward to an interesting discussion.
Hi, everybody. I'm Meg Tirrell. I cover medicine for CNBC. I'm super excited to be doing this panel for the third year in a row, and I think the only person who's been here this whole time with me is JF here. So we're excited to talk about investing in the cardiovascular space, and I'll ask each of the panelists actually to give a little introduction of who they are and how they think about investing, what spaces they focus on. Leslie.
My name is Leslie Bottorff, and I'm with GE Ventures, and I have a background the last 20 years in venture investing, primarily in medical devices with a private firm, and have been with GE for 3 years investing in digital health. And prior to that, I was 19 years in the medical device industry. And in terms of what I'm investing in, GE is investing in digital health companies that are changing the way patients are engaged and physicians are engaged and communicate. We're looking for companies that are advanced diagnostics and also minimally invasive procedures. We're looking for companies that are making a difference in terms of productivity and also the cost reduction in terms of looking at the transition from fee-for-service to value-based care. And that's across, we're not doing any drug development investing, but we are investing across devices, even some therapeutic devices, as well as diagnostic and services all across the spectrum, informed by digital health and by some of the new IT techniques that are emerging.
So I'm Jean-François Formela. I'm a partner at Atlas Venture. We do early stage venture, so we primarily do startup companies, and as opposed to my neighbor and colleague here, we do only drug discovery and focus on new biology, new modalities, and new ways to create new medicine. So that's what we do.
And I'm Bob Hopkins from Bank of America Merrill Lynch. I'm the managing director and equity research analyst for the group. I cover the medical device space. So I write research on all the publicly traded medical device companies, everything from J&J and Medtronic all the way down to the smallest of companies. As long as they're public, I follow them. But we follow the entire industry. I've been doing it for 20 years, and I'm a passionate follower of this exciting space.
I'm Roger Kitterman. I work with the Partners Innovation Fund. We are the fund within Partners Healthcare that invests in the technologies developed there and spinning them out into companies. So we're about a $165 million fund, and we only invest in companies that are based on technologies that come out of one of the Partners Healthcare institutions, so primarily Mass General, Brigham and Women's, and McLean. Within that, we then don't subspecialize. We do therapeutics, we do diagnostics, we do healthcare IT, and we do medical devices. So we've made investments in each of those kinds of categories of companies. That being said, the research base that we are drawing from, we tend to do more therapeutics than any other kind of investment.
I'm Jamie Topper. I'm a molecular biologist and a cardiologist by background, but for the last 15 years, I've been a managing general partner at Frazier Healthcare Ventures. We are a dedicated healthcare private equity firm managing a little over $3 billion in assets at this point. I run the life science group, and we focus purely on life science venture, which very much like JF is all drug development. We do all stages from very early to even commercialized drugs. and we invest across all therapeutic areas, including cardiovascular.
Wonderful. And I want to encourage everybody to submit questions. Anything you want to know from this panel, including how to get them to invest in whatever research you're working on, I will be using this iPad here. So let's start with you, Bob, covering the public side. How would you describe sort of the market for cardiovascular products? How has it been growing? What would you say the climate is really in investing in that right now?
I would say right now the climate for investing in cardiovascular medicine is very robust. The industry's gone through some cycles, but right now with the help of Edwards, Boston Scientific, and Medtronic, and the creation of the TAVR marketplace, that over just a short period of time has become a $3 billion market, growing 40%. Unlike in the drug world, we don't have too many of those in medical devices. Frankly, of all the spaces that I cover, I think there's only 3 markets that are both over $1 billion and growing more than 10% in all of medtech. Cardiovascular medicine is one of the very exciting areas right now. Heart valve being a key area of it, but more just cardiovascular than just interventional medicine generally. We're right at the beginning of a revolution in the treatment of acute stroke, using very similar technologies that we use in cardiovascular medicine. So, there was a time when the industry sort of matured, ICDs, stents. Over the last couple of years have really matured, but now with valvular disease, stroke, and atrial fibrillation, a couple of other areas, there's a really a lot going on right now that's quite interesting in this area. So, from a medical device perspective, I think it's one of the most exciting times in my 20 years of following the industry.
Well, then, for a drug perspective, maybe JF or Jamie, how do you look at the investment opportunities in cardiovascular when you are comparing it with everything else you could invest in?
Well, I mean, historically, the challenge has been that you need some very large late-stage trial, right? Phase 2 and phase 3, and as a result, pharma companies were a bit shy in the partnering side. It was difficult to get a lot of value at an early stage compared to some other disease area. So you had to be very careful. And we went upstream, so we're focused entirely on pure innovation. And so I know the panel right before us was precision medicine, but I would say genetics is where we see a lot of the opportunity, trying to essentially segment the phenotype into genotypic subtype and try to focus on new target, new mechanism, and leverage the fact that now we have a lot of new modalities at our disposal to try to actually attack that new biology. So, we've tried to go actually upstream and to focus on pure innovation, opportunities that might be really fully differentiated, that might induce the pharma company to take a bet earlier, as opposed to going to areas that might be less differentiated, where you know that you're going to have very large phase 3 trial, and it's much more difficult to monetize for the venture capitalists. So I'll leave it at that. We can jump more, but I'm sure that Jamie has his own perspective.
I agree with everything you said, JF. Despite being very passionate about cardiovascular disease as a cardiologist, it has its challenges as a focus for, sort of classical life science venture investing, the things that Atlas and Frazier do. Them being, the typical clinical development programs for these large unmet needs are very long and very capital intensive. And that's a challenge for the venture model. So we have and are continuing to invest in the space, but we're looking for focused opportunities where, based on biomarkers and innovative unmet needs, we can streamline those processes.
Well, Roger, I'd ask the same of you. I'm looking, as you do, both at therapeutics and diagnostics. What kind of opportunities do you see? Is it a similar way of trying to stratify, almost making this huge disease area a rare disease and treating it that way?
Yeah, I think that's if you take the last 2 panels together, where it talks about clinical trials and about precision medicine, that's what we look at. So what we're trying to do is avoid that 30,000 patient clinical trial at the end of the day, and find some subsets of cardiovascular disease where you can really show a real difference in a much smaller patient population. And 2 areas that you can look at are, one is where it's an orphan cardiovascular disease, but there's a clear genetic basis for the disease, and those exist. And then the second is there a way to stratify the patients where going in, here's the set of patients that are not going to do well. And if you know with the patients that are not going to do well, then you can make your trial much smaller to show some real effect.
And Leslie, in your space, you hear a lot of sort of hype around digital health. How do you differentiate what's real, what's really going to change things from just people getting really excited about creating apps and using technology? And
Right. Well, I think that we look at it as it has to create an overall solution to something that we did before. But the way I see it is digital health is able to empower exponentially some of the same procedures and the same devices and services that we are doing before. And so we really look at the end of the day at what the value add is there. And I was in the medical device business for 35 years, and that became very difficult to do on a venture model, frankly. And Bob, I know, has followed this all the way. Those TAVR results that are happening right now, I mean, those were investments done in the early 2000s, and that's very difficult for the venture model for that kind of time frame. But what's happened now with some of these technologies like image analytics, analytics on the actual procedure performance itself, patient engagement tools, physician engagement and adherence tools, those kinds of things is really taking it to the next level in a less expensive and more productive way, and also allowing these types of skill sets that we have, particularly in highly specialized areas where doctors from the hospitals here in Boston may have particular skill, allowing them to scale that so they can deliver it much more broadly. And they can really leverage their specialty expertise to a broader audience. And I think that's an incredible revenue opportunity as well as an incredible practice and care opportunity. So we're really looking for that value add. We're not doing ourselves pure consumer. And that doesn't mean you can't make money at consumer. Obviously, people have. Fitbit was very successful. But we have chosen to go the medical professional route, and let's see what we're doing to care for patients now, make that better, make it scale better, make it less costly, and a higher productivity.
what do you find is the appetite of physicians, medical professionals to having to learn these new tools? I mean, they're so busy already, and you say, okay, well, this is going to help you down the road, but you have to take the time to understand a new system. Is that a barrier?
It is a barrier because there is certainly a learning curve, and everyone needs to get used to the new system and what that will mean to them. I think the bigger barrier is the same thing that's been a barrier to the medical device business, is just the payment systems. You have to figure out how the hospital or the provider systems are going to pay for these things. But luckily, many of these innovations that are coming forward are, in fact, fantastic productivity tools. They really change the game in that way. So while the question may be right now, and I'm thinking of one example, I've invested in an image analytics company that changes the whole game for the initial application is cardiac MR. And so the question, and it's very new, very nascent right now, is, gee, how are we going to pay for these subscriptions to these image analytics? But in 2 years, I think it's going to be, gee, can we afford not to get this because our competitors are, and they're automating a lot of work, so we can focus on the clinical aspect of this and some of the more high value add aspects of this, and have a lot of the work that was mundane be automated for us. And I don't think that should be scary to radiologists, frankly, because there's a lot of things like drawing circles for and annotating images that that's really not probably their favorite thing to do. And all that kind of thing can be annotated and done very easily. And they can focus more on, gee, what is the deeper information that we can get from these machines and apply it clinically, and how can we take the genomic information or the lab results and put that with this information for a deeper understanding of what to do with this patient. And that gets to a precision medicine, not just for drugs. It's usually been thought of as a drug comment, but it's not just for drugs. It's across the whole solution of how we treat the patient, including devices, procedures, how we're going to engage with that patient.
Well, our first question might be for Bob, but if anybody else wants to weigh in, of course, we're talking about the TAVR space, transcatheter aortic valve replacement. Paul asks, who do you think will be the big winners in the mitral valve space?
Well, mitral valve has gone through its sort of usual cycle within medtech where people get very excited and then quickly learn how challenging something is, and now we're sort of in a stage where there's a lot of companies pursuing it. I would argue right now there is no clear leader. We have some early clinical data on the mitral side. We have a lot of really smart people working on it, a couple of different approaches. But the companies that are out in front, Edwards, Abbott, Medtronic, those are the three that really stick out on the mitral side that have made the most progress. But there's lots of early stage companies too. It's one of the great unmet needs in medtech right now. I'm very optimistic that by 2019 there could actually be approved products selling on the market in Europe if the clinical pathways are met along the way, which is a big if, because so far it's obviously been a real challenge to drive successful outcomes. So those are the three that I'd mention. It's very early. It's very exciting. But to Leslie's point, this is probably in the United States, we're talking about 2023, 24, 25 before this is a huge market. Again, if things go well.
So you're not picking one favorite?
Right now, frankly, of all the people that have been implanted with a mitral valve, half of them unfortunately have passed away. So we are really early in this. Personally, my money's on 12. And for those that know the field, know that that's a Medtronic product, but it's very early.
I definitely didn't know what 12 meant, so I'm glad you did. So this is a question for probably everybody. Jill asks, what is your time horizon for return on investment? And maybe Jamie will start at the end and kind of come this way.
So when we make an investment, we are typically looking at sort of a 3 to 5 year time horizon. So like Jeff, we do a lot of Series A and company creation, but we're looking for opportunities where 1 or 2 rounds of venture capital, call it $50, $60 million all in, 3 to 5 years, you can get through whatever the value inflection point of that development program is. And then we target exits by M&A. And one of the nice things about biotech innovation these days is there's a massive acquirer universe, a little bit different than the medical device world where there's a handful of acquirers. On the biotech side, if you have an interesting development program that has been de-risked, achieved proof of concept, you typically have 10 to 20 people interested in buying you out of the universe of several hundred natural buyers. So
We're not seeing a lot of M&A right now. And we were talking with Bob Bradway earlier on CNBC, Amgen's CEO, and he was saying the valuations are a little stretched right now. Are you feeling that in terms of exits through M&A?
We aren't. I think we're still seeing some from our portfolio, a steady beat of M&A, over the last 3 years. It's been pretty constant. It's a relatively small portfolio, but it just keeps ticking along. So I think if you have really good companies that have really compelling science behind them and a really compelling opportunity, you've got something there and it's going to get bought.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Maybe Bob was talking about the broader environment, thinking maybe about later stage public company acquisition where, I think you can see some cycles depending on people's balance sheet and the mood in the market. But for earlier stage M&A, you see plenty of activity. And in terms of the question that was asked, what are we looking for in terms of, horizon period? The subjective answer is as short as possible. The more interesting answer is what's the data out there. The average holding period for the asset class for venture capital historically, and hasn't changed very much, is about 7 years. I would say that some of the funds that have gone upstream, like Frazier, us and a few others, going earlier and looking at those earlier M&A opportunity, we've seen the holding period actually shrinking. So for us, in terms of our M&A pool over the past 3 years, we just ran the data recently. Our holding period is probably about 4 years. So we've seen a dramatic change in the holding period. And it has to do with the fact that if you focus on innovation and on things that are truly differentiated, people are going to be willing to take a chance earlier.
Who's investing in things that aren't differentiated or innovative, though?
Well, I think people who invest in slightly later stage might invest in things that are already biologies that might be more proven, where you take less of a biology risk, but you take more of a commercial/clinical development risk, because it's unclear how differentiated you're going to end up by the end of phase 2 or certainly in terms of your label. So if you focus on new biology and new modality, the risk is higher, but you're more differentiated.
Before we move on, anybody else want to answer the ROI time horizon question?
Well, I think it's a little bit different with devices and digital health. I mean, we're investing across the stage spectrum, except for we're not doing any seed investing, maybe a little bit more toward later stage investing, and that's a bit shorter time horizon, certainly than the drug, the molecule investing. But what I would say is that this whole period of early commercial is sort of also through the valley of death in a certain way in digital health, because these are all new models. And the providers and often these companies are selling to health plans or insurers, and they are getting into the game, but they're just, everyone's sort of, we're in the sausage making stage. Everyone's sort of figuring out how are these business models going to go? How are they going to be paid for? How does it work out for both the startup companies as well as the big companies and the providers and insurers? And so it's going to be lumpy. And I think that there's going to be companies that will have, on the S-curve of adoption, a very sort of long period of early adopters and some gradual acceptance until all of a sudden you have to be in it or you're not competitive. And then it's going to be a very fast adoption to make it standard of care. And that's how I would see this going. So it does require patience on the behalf of the investors for that, let's call it, 2 to 4 or 5 year period where they're commercial, but they're really building up their model and working toward when it's becoming standard of care.
Well, go ahead.
So the other thing I would say is that we invest in both devices and in therapeutics, and the assumption is generally in the world that medical devices, you exit quicker than you do with therapeutics, but actually our experience has been the opposite, that we've been exiting our therapeutic companies much more quickly than we have our device companies, because the device companies need to be more mature before we can exit them.
Oh, well, that actually leads me into a question asked by the audience from Matt. Medical devices have experienced a significant decline in VC funding, and what will it take for it to come back, and will it ever come back?
So actually, there was an uptick in device funding for Series A startups last year for the first time in many years. But if you look behind the data, the reality is that's because you start to see things like wearables and other kinds of medical devices that we may not think of as traditional medical devices, and there is increasing funding going into that area. For the traditional medical devices, it's really how's the ecosystem working and how much capital do you need to get to that exit, and then what are people willing to pay? That's working really well on the therapeutic side. It's not working so well on the device side. We can do innovative business models on the therapeutic side where we do a build to buy, where we partnered the company really as we're starting the company. We would love to do that on the device side, but we haven't found the right company and the right technology to do that yet.
Well, I think one of the reasons why it's so hard is because just like for later stage investing in drugs, in device, you probably need to be best in class, and people are not going to jump in until they know you're best in class. So it's going to take you more money and typically more time to actually show you're best in class. If you're going after first in class in a differentiated opportunity, the minute you have some things that might be tractable, you're likely to see more interest. We've certainly seen that because, historically, I'm sure some people in the audience are scratching their head listening to Jimmy and I saying that, we can exit faster from early stage investment. It's true, but the reason being is that we get bought in late preclinical, very early clinical. We don't have to wait for POC. And so it's a different paradigm. And in devices, it's very hard to do that. You can get bought with very early data in the device space.
Well, one thing I'm interested in hearing from all of you guys is you're seeing an increasing interest from tech investors in the healthcare space. And as we talk about time horizons, that seems to be one thing that differentiates maybe early tech investors versus early healthcare investors. You guys have to be a lot more patient oftentimes. How do you look at that incoming money? Does it affect what you do at all? Leslie?
I think it does. I think that it affects valuation for one thing. So they tend to be willing to pay more because I think they don't know what all's involved in terms of the regulatory aspects of this market sometimes, as well as the reimbursement aspects of that. But they obviously learn that quickly. But I think it's good for our industry though, because it brings a whole different angle and element to the mix, especially if you're on boards or working with companies with these people. It's a nice mix to have healthcare investors along with tech investors. But the one thing I will say that's something to be cautious of in terms of tech investors is they do get an idea that FDA, aren't they quaint? You know, we're Google, or we used to be at Google or whatever, and we don't really need to deal with the FDA. You know,
We've seen that run into huge
literally, I
problems.
mean, like this imaging analytics area is certainly a good area as an example. And there are a lot of companies started by tech people, and they never did design controls, a quality system, or any of the things that you eventually have to do to get an FDA approval, or at least a 510K approval. And they're out touting their information as clinically, you know, useful information. They're making diagnostics and prognostications, and they can't do that, and they can be shut down by the FDA. And you know, the medical healthcare companies, especially a company like GE, of course, can't touch that because, you know, if we got called on the carpet by the FDA, they'd shut down the rest of our business. So, you know, it's not something we can deal with. And then, you know, some of those companies have learned that, wow, we've got to go back and basically redo our entire software platform and algorithms from scratch with the right design controls and the right specifications in mind so that we can be FDA approved and we can actually report clinical information. Otherwise, you don't have to get an FDA approval if you're just transferring data. But if you're making clinical, you know, meaningful numbers, you have to get that FDA approval. So that's something that, you know, I think that a lot of tech investors will rudely wake up and find themselves in a bad position on. So it should be interesting.
Yeah, when you're dealing with an implantable medical device, you can't really fix it in the beta. So it's a different paradigm. But I will say that one of the things that we are very confident about, that we're going to be dealing with a lot more data from all of these sources. And that's really going to, sitting where I sit within a healthcare system, that's going to enable a lot of clinical innovation. And you know, where exactly that's going to go and where that clinical innovation is going to lead us, you know, we don't really know. But we do know that there's just going to be an enormous amount of data that we've never had before, and that's going to bring us down some pretty interesting paths.
I think tech investors can also be very helpful on the services side of healthcare, because ultimately that's where there's trillions of dollars sloshing around in sort of desperate need of some coherent reform, in my view. So I think the tech investors, whether it's managing big data or whether it's trying to come up with and help us along this path of moving to a new payment model, to me, that's where I think tech investors can sort of avoid FDA, CMS, but still add a lot of value in healthcare investing.
Well, when we were on the call preparing for this panel, I asked the panelists if there was anything they didn't want to talk about, and the one thing they said was politics. So I'm going to ask about politics. I'm just kidding. But I am going to ask about the FDA and the nominated FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, and also what you think historically the role FDA has played in the cardiovascular space, either in helping spur innovation and investment in the space or as a hindrance. And anybody can kind of take this one. And then I'd also love to hear what you think the FDA could do better.
Ooh. Jamie.
Yeah. Is Dr. Stockbridge in the room?
And I think Dr. Califf doesn't arrive until a little later. So
Rob,
he's not
yeah,
here.
Rob. So I'd say, listen, all of us who work in drug discovery and drug investment and biotech, the FDA is front and center on everything we do. And we all believe that they have everybody's best interest in mind, but like any big agency, they don't always operate as efficiently as they could. So we talked about this before. One of the examples we use with our investors is antibiotics. You know, all the pharmaceutical companies got out of antibiotics 20 years ago because the FDA was making it very difficult to develop a new antibiotic. You had to be superior in large trials over existing ones. And then, you know, people believed it was solved. Well, we all know it's not solved. Resistance came roaring back, and there was no innovation. And to the FDA's credit, as well as some legislative credit, give politics here, they've turned it around to the point where they are effectively bending over backwards to make it easier to develop new antibiotics. And it's working. We've made numerous antibiotic investments in novel antibiotics that have been highly successful because the FDA has worked with us very quickly and very efficaciously to help us design these things and lower the burden of, you know, on the opposite side, and a couple of the previous panels talked about this, you know, this idea that there's this CV signal with diabetes drugs prompted the FDA to then start requiring cardiovascular safety and outcomes trials. And that put a complete damper over time on innovation in the diabetes space, at least at the venture level. because you can't invest in a preclinical diabetes program when you know there's 7 phase 3 trials in front of you. You just can't make money doing that. Now, to their credit, and with data coming out that this is not a big issue and there's been some positive signals, it's starting to swing back. But I think it's a recognition that the policies that the FDA puts on various therapeutic areas and various development areas can have wide-ranging and very profound impacts on the attractiveness of that area for investment.
Is there a way you could see the FDA, and this could be for Jamie or for anybody, but to handle a situation like that where risks do appear to emerge, but also not stifling the innovation in this space so much by requiring such onerous trials? Is there a sort of happy medium that could be reached the FDA could pursue?
I think so. I mean, they do it all the time in oncology. I mean, these magnificent new oncology drugs we have significant risks associated with them, right? All these immuno-oncology drugs, autoimmune is a big deal. Targeted kinase inhibitors, some of them have very dramatic negative effects, but it's a risk-reward equation. And I think the recognition, at least in oncology, that you're looking at a life-threatening, morbid disease, and that real-time adjustments as opposed to sort of overall policy adjustments that are going to put a damper on things make more sense.
Yeah, I think another interesting angle, which maybe ties back to the discussion about where a tech investor can add value, is the potential use of real-world evidence as part of a longitudinal strategy to basically enable companies to get on the market sooner and then leverage real-world evidence to really tie up, so to speak, the label and the actual use of the drug in the community. So, I mean, it's a big topic of discussion, but it's certainly a very interesting one. And I think certainly with accountable healthcare organization, for example, if there is such a thing left in the current political environment, even though it was a great idea, you could actually do a lot of innovation by using actual data. So that's something that certainly people should continue to discuss, and the right technology and information technology platform could actually enable people to be able to use that sooner.
And on the device side, I would say that, for the last 10 years at least, it's always been, well, where do you start your trials? You start them in Europe. That's just what you do. And not because the bar is lower there, but because there's a lot more flexibility on how you can do the trials. And to its credit, the FDA has seen that and has said, well, maybe we need to be rethinking how we allow medical device companies to do trials in the US, and have adopted some more flexible early trial designs and allowed companies to do that.
I mean, going back to Jamie's example about the antibiotic change of policies, I think it's a prototype of the kind of policies that can actually help increase investment and increase the flow of new drug in development, where in a number of cases now you can actually get approved, or at least you can file an NDA with one phase 3 trial. They've reduced the size of the safety database. Obviously, they're still requiring a minimum amount of data, as they should, but they're not religious anymore. They've been, they're much more flexible, which is really what we need to see. And going back to your original question, Scott is I'm assuming a number of people here know Scott Gottlieb, who's been in the industry for many years. I think Scott really gets it to the extent that he can get through the nomination process, given the fact that he's been affiliated with a number of for-profit organizations. But I think he takes his role very seriously. And I think he's off to a very, very good start in terms of the kind of policy he's discussing right now. So I'm very optimistic, actually, that he's going to make an impact.
I'm going to break a journalistic rule here and ask a question I don't totally understand and trust that my panel can translate it for me. And I apologize in advance if I should know what AMCs stand for.
Academic medical centers.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. Are there things that academic medical centers could do to work more effectively with investors? For example, in getting basic discoveries closer to an inflection point? That question is from Anthony. Anybody?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, there has been, that's kind of the old topic around tech transfer offices, and there has been a push, which is everybody knows that, of trying to get some translational work done in academic institutions. For example, people have started to screen some small molecule library. At the end of the day, I think the output is very mixed so far. I don't think that drug discovery is a particular skill set, a particular experience set, and basic research is a different skill set. And so, I find it very difficult to mix the two, and I think it might be confusing some of the issues. I think we can have some real partnership, but to try to start building drug discovery organization inside academic institution is a bit of a slippery slope. I think there are ways to better share the value potentially through partnership and sponsored research agreement. At least that's my opinion. I think so. Obviously, I'd be very interested to see what Roger has to say. But I think that academic researchers should focus on novel biology, basic research discoveries, which is really the foundation of translation.
I think having an internal venture fund is a really good thing to do for academic medical centers to do this. And I say that in jest, but I actually really do believe it, because it's not just the fact that you have a venture fund and so you're investing in these companies alongside other VCs and therefore you're sitting on the same side of the table instead of across the table as you're trying to make these very difficult technology developments happen. But it also, you bring in a skill set to the institution that really does speak both languages, that has a foot in the academic side and understands what the challenges are on the academic side, at the same time sitting in the commercial world and understanding what the needs are there, and really trying to come together to meet the needs of everybody instead of people taking a position on one side and taking a position on the other side without a lot of understanding between the two. So I agree with JF. I don't think it means academic medical centers saying, okay, now we have a bunch of targets, let's start a internal drug discovery organization. But there's a world of CROs out there. There's a world of early stage venture capitalists who work very effectively with early stage academic science. Let's partner together and think about this. How do we do it together, as opposed to how do I get out of, what I can get out of this side or that side?
Well, we have less than 10 minutes left, and I want to ask a question to the whole panel. What's the most recent, coolest, most mind-blowing thing you've seen, whether or not you invested in it, in the research world? What's just the coolest thing you've come across in medicine recently? Anybody can start.
So it starts that way.
Go ahead.
Well, obviously, I'm partial to CRISPR because I actually started one as a CRISPR company, but
Which CRISPR company?
Intelia. So we actually just published data about reducing the TTR protein with one injection. So I have to be careful because I don't know what we disclose or not. But let's suffice to say that we're into very long, sustained 95% plus reduction with one injection. So the concept in animal model. So the concept of actually being able to cure some genetic disease with one course of therapy could become real within the next 5 to 10 years, and that's mind-boggling. And then a second one quickly, which is not really yet a technology that is moved into translation, but I'm sure many of you have seen the Pakistani cohort study, which is really expanding on the human knockouts, the studies that Decode had been doing a few years back. And I think from a genetic standpoint, it's absolutely fascinating to see that there are people probably in the room here that are walking around with homozygous loss of function, or gain of function, and have no phenotype. So that's it's a very interesting twist on genetics, and I think there will be a lot of interesting things coming out of those studies.
Definitely. Anybody else have cool things?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. One thing I'd mention is maybe not a mind-blowing example, but in terms of something that's just really cool and really struck me over the last couple of years is how it's really taken all the way until 2014 to come up with a good therapy to treat acute stroke. Mm-hmm. We now have that. It's an emerging market. There's 16 million strokes that happen every single year around the world. Probably 4 million of those that could be treated. And in terms of the direct impact on patients' lives, I don't think I've ever seen a technology have such an incredible impact. And what's amazing to me is it's such a simple idea. These are companies that are just creating little grabbers that go up into the brain and yank the clot out. Why is it that took until 2014 to come up with? I have no idea. But it is having an amazing, immediate impact on patients' lives, and we're just getting started. So I think I watch a lot of cases in my job. It's very rare when I see someone come into an operating room completely flat on their back on the verge of death and walk out of the operating room. And that's the kind of thing we're seeing with acute stroke right now. So just in terms of sort of a cool factor and impact on patients' lives, and just at the very beginning, the treatment of acute stroke with a little grabber that goes into the brain ranks very high in my mind.
Well, Stryker is working on that, right?
Stryker, Medtronic, and Penumbra are the three companies that are really pioneering this, but we're just, for example, 16 million strokes every year, and there were 22,000 of treatments of acute stroke last year. So we're in stage one.
Wow.
So I think that one of the things that I think is going to have a huge impact, or maybe the most impact over the next few years, is mobile health. And I say that broadly, mobile health of all types. We're now seeing come forward because here's a key thing: the global view, the people of the world. Many of them are unbanked. They don't have a bank. They don't necessarily have regular health care. There are many things that they don't have. They may not have even adequate, shelter and food, but a huge portion of the people of the world have phones. And you can go into really rural countries and a huge amount of people have phones. And so what we're seeing come forward is there are mobile applications and software for eye disease, for all sorts of diabetic type diseases, control and complications. We saw a mobile phone used as a coloscope, as skin care. There's ECGs and other cardiac type things. And if you think about that, most of these countries don't have specialists. I mean, there might be, like in China, I think the number was like 200 ophthalmologists or something.
Really?
It was a crazy number that I don't remember exactly what it was, and a huge amount of people that would need these services, right? But if somebody that's not even a clinician, but is a person that has a phone, could go to a village and provide a lot of different types of services for the various problems that those patients have, and prescribe something that they can do for those patients, or maybe they're the ones that are sent to the city, then the scale is incredible at how broad a healthcare you can deliver with that kind of tool that huge amounts of people that are in rural areas still do have. Yeah.
Roger, Jamie?
So we were involved in a different CRISPR company, but that's definitely a very exciting area of
Which
innovation. Editas.
I'd just like to know.
And I would say that rather than singling out a specific technology, because we work with a lot of early stage innovation, and there are people in the room who I can see who are in the process of starting companies with, so I don't want to single out one over the other. But what amazes me about sitting in an academic medical center is how much innovation there is going on right now in so many areas that are clearly addressing unmet needs that seem like they weren't going to be addressable. And that's a really exciting time.
Yeah, I'd say for me, it's been sort of the observation over the last 4 or 5 years in the fields of non-Hodgkin lymphoma and leukemias, and we're seeing in real time, and no small part due to several companies we invested in, it's going from something that was sort of modestly treated with cytotoxic therapy to an all-oral, non-cytotoxic curative therapies. And it's happening at breakneck speed, so it's just an amazing thing to watch happen in real time.
Well, I'm glad we have a little time, 3 minutes left. I want to ask about the idea of trying to stratify patients and almost sort of treat cardiovascular disease as individual, almost rare diseases. Does that keep us from treating these huge needs, patient populations, keep us from coming up with solutions that will help the most people? Or is that a route to coming up with medicines that ultimately will help the most people?
Well, I don't think it's mutually exclusive, right? But to being able to get to higher resolution genotypic stratification, I think at the end of the day is a good step toward helping more people in a more specific way. So I don't see that as antinomic. I think that's actually complementary. Going back to the point about genetics, I think there is no doubt that particularly looking at some things that we're particularly interested in is association or any kind of genetic linkage in non-coding region. Right now, most of the GWAS and most of the genetic work has been done in exonic sequencing and essentially protein coding genes, and those are 2% of the human genome. So we have a huge amount of biology that is totally uncovered, or uncovered, not yet covered, that I think we should be focusing on.
Anybody else? We have one question we didn't get to with a minute and a half left from Carolina. In the digital health space, how are you approaching interoperability issues in healthcare?
Yeah, interoperability is another one of the challenges for sure for digital health. But I think that that those problems will be worked out as we sort of go along the adoption curve, particularly with cloud, the adoption of cloud. And a lot of institutions are very reluctant to go to the cloud because of security concerns. But even those are being worked around, where solutions where they can keep the PHI information in the VPN of the hospital and still take advantage of cloud computing. Systems are being developed that allow that. And so I think that those will be overcome. Unfortunately, the leaders in the electronic medical record sort of built in fences to make that difficult, and I think that's one of the frustrations of that old era when it was adopted, and they weren't building interoperability solutions, so basically they're being built around. And there are other companies that are providing that and working, and putting information in and out of these systems and just working around it in terms of interoperability. So certainly one of the things to work on and overcome, but it's going to happen.
Is the natural incentive for companies to try to be interoperable as they're building the new systems, or is there a natural incentive to keep it walled off so you can try to be the leader and have the biggest share?
Well, I think the natural gut instinct is to try to keep it proprietary, but I think the lesson has been learned that that's not going to work. And so you have to be the best at other things. You have to provide other differentiation besides, your data being kept in fences and captive. So I think that's not going to occur with this coming wave of companies.
Well, fingers crossed. All right. Thanks, everybody. And thank you guys.
Thank you.